Well, the single biggest deal is that this should have been detected. Hamas is the group that the Israelis are most concerned about monitoring. And in theory, they have them shot through with plenty of human intelligence gathering operations. And of course, it's right on their border. So signals intelligence should be pretty good. And the idea that you could have conservatively 500 fighters, probably closer to 1,000, cross the border in a surprise assault that from 20 different vectors using a half a dozen different transport methods, and none of it was detected before it went down. That is an intelligence failure that is just colossal. This isn't like 9/11, where it was some fringe group using a novel method of attack. These are all known factors. And for the Israelis to miss this, I mean, at a minimum, this is going to cause the downfall of the government, which a lot of people probably think is not all that bad of a thing. But it's definitely going to cause a complete top to bottom overhaul of how the Israelis do everything, just like it did the last time something like this went down 50 years ago when the Israelis reformed their intelligence systems in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War and became the world standard. So somehow, somewhere in the last 20 years, it's all fallen apart. And it makes you wonder what else they're missing.
Seems
Right,
that
and there's pros and cons of each method, but the foes that the United States is primarily concerned about are in a different hemisphere. So you can understand why signals intelligence forms a stronger pillar for us. Gaza was right there. Again, we don't have any information. The most logical conclusion today, which might be proven wrong tomorrow, is that it's a new faction within Hamas, because there's dozens of them, and it could just be a new one that popped up and somehow managed to recruit several hundred people. Even that doesn't hold together very well. If I was a guessing man, I would say that that was the primary rationale for the timing, if not the attack itself. Definitely for the brutality as well. You're looking at things that Hamas has now done in the last week that even ISIS never got around to doing in terms of just the human denigration. And so it's going to be very, very difficult for the folks in Riyadh to still proceed to cut a deal with Israel. Now, for those of you who don't like live and breathe this area, quick primer. There are lots and lots and lots of factions across the Middle East, but there's really four that matter. You've got the Turks, different ethnicity, but Sunni Muslim, semi-secular. You've got the Sunnis, which Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Egypt, that's the dominant group, Sunni Arabs. The third group are the Israelis, the Jews, and then the fourth are Shia Persian, so different religious sect, different ethnicity, and that's Iran. And what has been going on for the last, let's call it a decade, but really intensely started in the second year of the Trump administration, was a normalization of the relationship between the second and the third factions. The Sunni Arabs that make up the vast majority and the vast majority of the economy, and then the Jews who have the technology and the relationship with the United States. And the idea was that if you can get those two factions on the same side, then the rest of the Middle East will more or less take care of itself. Now, there are any number of ways that you can manage the Middle East. This is one. I'm not saying it's better or worse than any particular one, but this is the one that the Biden and the Trump administrations broadly agreed on behind closed doors. They will never say that out loud, but it's a by administration strategy. And the United Arab Emirates and Morocco have already gone down that path. And the question was whether Saudi Arabia, the biggest, the most powerful, the richest of the Sunni states, would follow. And within Riyadh, there is a familial argument. I mean, we all know about those intergenerational arguments we have at family reunions, where all the aunts and the uncles and the parents are on one side and all the cousins and the kids are on the other side. And it doesn't matter how old you are, those arguments really don't change. Well, for the older generation, the defining characteristics of the Arab identity is that the Palestinians are Arabs too. And so any sort of deal that is struck with anyone has to at least pay homage to the idea that the Palestinians should be able to control their own territory. But the next generation down, led by Mohammed bin Salman, who's a millennial, is like, yeah, whatever, that's your problem, old man. The Palestinians have never done anything for us. Gaza is an open-air prison camp. Even if we wanted to do something with it, we couldn't with all of our money. So just let it rot, and let's cut a deal with the power that matters, and that's Israel. And that will usher in a new Middle East where we lead the entire Arab world against Iran. Now, that might be a little over optimistic, but it's not ridiculous. So what's going on in Riyadh right now is the older generation, which includes the king, and the younger generation, which includes the king apparent,
Mhm.
are fighting about it. And we will know within a month who comes out on top based on what the Saudi position is versus Iran and Hamas. TBD. Uh, it would consolidate a certain side. And something to remember with all of this is these two countries started this without us.
Mhm.
When we made it very clear that we weren't thrilled with the Israelis for things they were doing in the occupied territories, we withdrew some military support. And we did the same for the Saudis for what they were doing in their own region. And so the Israelis and the Saudis, for about 15 years now, have been playing the United States off of them each other, and in doing so, have gotten more weapons and more technology and more funding than we would have normally generated. With the Israelis providing military training for the Saudis, and the Saudis providing intelligence on Iran for the Israelis, they already have de facto a fairly robust bilateral relationship. The question is whether the United States feels it needs to have an active role in that. So our role in these talks have mostly been handholding. This isn't like discussions between us and the Iranians where we don't meet directly and the Swiss have to run back and forth with messages. We're kind of the third wheel here. Well, let's start with the bigger two players. The Chinese and the Russians do not like one another. It's an alliance of convenience. And the standing Russian position is that the Chinese ever cross the border into Siberia, that the Russians won't meet them with tanks and troops. They'll just nuke them.
Mhm.
And when that is kind of like the basis of the relationship, you can imagine how much trust there is. They don't like each other. It's a marriage of convenience at the time. The Chinese really, really, really are enjoying the stalemate that has erupted in the Ukraine war because it means everybody's eyes are over there rather than on China. And that's convenient. And it's in many ways the flip of what the Russian position was when the Americans were facing off against the Chinese during the Trump administration. They were like, hey, this is great. We can start moving things into play to grab territory we want while the Americans are focused over there. So there is absolutely no love lost.
Mhm.
Alliance of convenience. That doesn't mean irrelevant. It's just if circumstances evolve, they will stab each other in the back in seconds. Iran doesn't get along with either the Russians or the Chinese nearly as well as they get
Mhm.
along with one another. The Iranians look down on the Chinese as an inferior society. The feeling is mutual. And the Russians and the Iranians have fought any number of wars over the Caucasus. And whenever Azerbaijan decides to get a little uppity, the Iranians get really pissed off because for the Russians, the Azerbaijanis are not a threat. They're small, they're remote. There's some arguments over energy transport policy, but nothing really that cuts to the core of Moscow's interests. But the single largest minority in Azerbaijan, or excuse me, the single largest minority in Iran are Azerbaijanis. And so the
Mhm.
very existence of an independent Azerbaijan, Iran sees as a threat. And now that the Russians are pulling out of the Caucasus and Azerbaijan is taking the fight to Armenia, for Russia, they always knew they were going to sell out the Armenians. But for the Iranians, this is like the last brick in the wall breaking away to generate what they're fearing is going to be an irredentist Azerbaijan right on their doorstep with unofficial Russian blessing. So any collaboration between the Russians and the Iranians is through clenched teeth. It's
Mhm.
not that the two players don't see a reason to cooperate. This area is messy. Everyone has been an ally or an enemy at one time or another, or both. Uh, but there's no love there. And the Iranians are fully aware that, in the Russian eyes, at best, they're a distraction to be used. And it's entirely possible that today, while the Russians may, emphasis on the word may, have had a finger in what's going on with Hamas, and that may be something that the Iranians are broadly in favor of, they'll again sell each other out in a second if they think they can get a better deal from the United States.
Crude oil.
I don't know offhand if they're number one. If not, they're pretty close. But remember, Iran doesn't trade very much. So they've got a much slimmed down oil portfolio and they import most of their food. And that's about the end of the trading relationship.
Hmm. So we've been wanting to.
Let me
Yeah,
be
man.
clear. If it wasn't for the hostage situation, the U.S. would have no interest in being anywhere near this. But one of
Mhm.
kind of the unofficial agreements that you make with the U.S. government, if you're a citizen, is that no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, no matter your circumstances, no matter your crimes, we will come for you. And as soon as we know where those hostages are, we will go in hard. We will not subcontract that out to a third party. And that's why the carrier is in place. And that's the only reason the carrier is in place. People like to say, oh, this is a deterrent for Hezbollah, but we're not going to get involved in that because it's not the sort of situation that a carrier can fix. If you want to root out Hezbollah, very different circumstances from Hamas. Hamas is several thousand, several tens of thousands, several 100,000, don't know what the number is, among a densely populated open air prison of 3 million people, and going door to door through that to clear it out. Even if we threw the entire US military at that, that would not be enough for that job. So I do not envy what's in front of the Israelis or in front of the Palestinians on that front. There is no way that is going to be anything but hideous. Lebanon actually has terrain. It's mountainous, there are forests, and so it's a more traditional Afghan style operation, if you will, and we want nothing to do with that.